Hi,
Hi.
Shashank.
Sorry, I haven't done
How?
this before, so I didn't realize it's my back camera.
No problem, no problem. Our last live started with me for a few minutes talking with the back camera on very happily, and nobody could see me smile. So don't
Yeah.
don't worry about it.
Yeah,
It happens to the best
I
of
didn't
us.
realize. I thought the camera is not working. I realized later that it's a back camera.
Yeah, no, don't worry about it at all. We have a couple of people joining us already, Shashank. So let's go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this lovely Thursday evening live where we're decoding something quite complex. But thanks to Shashank, we have some able assistance as we go through that process. My name is Antara. I'm the founder of Civis, and today we're joined by Shashank, who is a lawyer, a research fellow at the Vidhi Center for Legal Policy, who is closely working on environmental and disability issues, and is also very closely associated with the Politics and Disability Forum. Today, we're talking about a series of new amendments that have come out from the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment, which are all looking at creating accessible public spaces. Some of you may have joined us for the last conversation where we were speaking about airports and flying being made more accessible. Today, there are actually certain notifications around cultural venues as well as sports facilities, which we're keen to go deeper into with Shashank. So, without further ado, Shashank, thank you so much for joining us and for taking a gamble and doing this IG Live with us. Hopefully, this is the first of many more to come. So,
Yeah.
it's good to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Antara. I'm glad. And this is the experiment that I haven't done, so we'll see how it goes. But thank you so much for having me here. I hope that I can sort of declutter something out of these guidelines, which are in themselves very complicated.
Mhm. Absolutely. So, Shashank, I think for starters, could you tell us a little bit about your work at the Politics and Disability Forum? We'd love to learn a little bit more.
Right. So that's actually just to clear the air. That's not my full-time work. I'm a lawyer and work full-time with Buddhi Center for Legal Policy. Politics and Disability Forum was sort of a idea that I came up with in my last work when I was working as a legislative assistant. During the course of my work there, the thing that I observed was that we talk about disability and the disabled people in every space, employment, education, and skill development.
Mhm.
Political space is something wherein interests of disabled people are not talked about. And also, one of the foremost reason why there is no conversation was there is no data or there is no literature. So from
Mhm.
therein, the idea originated that yes, I should work upon producing literature and uncovering data and information, which is political representation. So from there on,
Mhm.
I sort of founded this forum wherein, along with my friends, we produce literature and engage with respective stakeholders in highlighting this political empowerment issue. So yeah, that's how the origin of it, how it originated.
Super. Okay, great. Thanks so much for that introduction. And you're right, representation is really required in different spheres. So it's good to see that that's happening through the forum as well. I think, Shashank, to dive straight into a little bit of the amendments and the changes that have been happening of late. My big question is this. We've seen actually a number of different amendments come out from the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment in the form of policies in the past month alone. I mean, we're clocking three, and I hear that there are more to come. So,
Yeah.
could you tell us a little bit about what has prompted this sudden spurt in legislation or policy making around this topic? Is it something in particular, or is it a broader trend? Would love to know more.
Right. Just to, I mean, as you mentioned that you have clocked three and there are many more to come, I'll just give the exact figure which how many more are to come because I have a list of the
Mhm.
guidelines that are yet to come. So there is Ministry of Home Affairs, Ministry of Rural Development, Ministry of Port and Shipping, Ministry of Tourism, Ministry of Financial Affairs,
Mhm.
Ministry of Information Technology, and Ministry of Education. So these are
Right.
seven guidelines that are yet to come.
Mhm.
As you mentioned, so before this, you had a conversation on civil aviation, and this is about tourism and culture. So just to tell people that these guidelines should have come a long time back. It's it's not something that they are suddenly waking up to and realizing that yes, we need these guidelines. These are mandated by law. So just to give you a broad, a backdrop of why these guidelines are necessary in terms of legal framework. So RPWD Act talks about this reasonable, non-discrimination under Section 3. And then in section 40 talks specifically about accessibility, wherein there is a mandate for central government to ensure accessibility across domains, that is transport, communication, and other spheres. So, section 40 sort of mandates broader accessibility issue. And then from section 42 to 46, you see that there are different spheres wherein there is a specific section for transport, where there is specific section for, information and communication technology, right? So these are the specific mandates that are there in our RPWD Act. Now, also, what Rights of Person with Disabilities Act of 2016 does is it also accords legal right to person with disabilities, and these are mentioned, as specific sections. So, for instance, for this conversation, when we talk about Ministry of Culture and Ministry of Sports, so Section 29 talks about right to cultural and recreational activities, that no disabled person should be discriminated in these activities. And Section 30 talks about that all disabled persons should have an equal right in participating in sport activities. Right. So this is a legal mandate that exists. Now, the Section 100 of the RPWD Act also allows government to frame rules, for implementation of the rights and the mandate that is in the Act. So the central government came up with 20 rules, that is rights of person with disability rules in 2017, right? And so RPWD rules sort of provide a deeper insight onto how these accessibility mandates should be carried out. So now the guidelines or the amendments that you are seeing here, which are brought which are brought by Social Justice Ministry, are amendments to Rule 15 specifically. So currently, as the rules exist, just has two sections, 15.1 and 15.2.
Okay.
So in 15.1, there is three sub-clauses. So the first sub-clause is the guidelines of built-in environment, which were released in 2016. The second is of information and communication, and the third is for transport, which were released 2 years back, right? And now these sub clauses are being added. So the you will see the guideline released by Ministry of Culture will be a clause E, and the guideline released by Ministry of Sports will be guideline sub clause F in that 15.1, right? And the more will follow as and when these guidelines come in, right? So these guidelines, by incorporating within the rule, are now the legal mandate. So all the things that you read in the guidelines are the legal mandate. Now, why I say they are late in coming up with these guidelines, because so the Act itself has prescribed timeline of when these accessibilities shall be ensured. So Section 48 talks about that these accessibility shall be ensured within 2 years of rules being implemented. Right. Now
Right.
we don't know which rules are they talking about. If they mean 2017 rules, then 2 years end in 2019. But if they means ministry specific rules, so the ministry specific rules are coming now. So you can imagine the accessibility timeline will be 25. Right. So the mandate exists from 2017, right? And the ministries are now finalizing their guidelines. And another thing is that these guidelines have been in pipeline for some time. For instance, the Ministry of Information and Broadcast, which is about to come with its own guidelines, from 2021 is saying that we will notify guidelines soon. We will notify guidelines soon, right? So these are guidelines are in pipeline from 2018 at least. So yeah, this is the broad legal framework why now you are seeing more of these guidelines coming up.
Right. Okay. So, thanks for that, Shashank. And I think, as all policies go, it's almost, to my mind, as you were talking about this, it's almost like a tree formation, right? There's one sort of piece of it that branches out into various rules, guidelines, and that's how action is actually taken. So, I think before we proceed to the next question, I just want to underscore that it's by participating in consultations and actually making representations at this stage that you can eventually impact the larger goal. And these branches are equally important as anything else. So let's in specific, Shashank, if I could request you to just tell us, some of us in the audience may be new to the space and may not have a full understanding of what these two guidelines are actually talking about. Could you take us through it in your own way of explaining it to us as to what are these two guidelines and what is the ambit that they cover?
Right, sure. So I'll go to the Ministry of Culture first. So Ministry of Culture has come up with its guideline to provide accessibility requirements of how the accessibility shall be ensured for the department that come under it, right? So the major department that comes under it is Archaeological Survey of India, which manages all the monuments across India, right? So all the accessibility mandate for those monuments are directly linked to Ministry of Culture. So the guideline that you see are sort of has a substantial value in terms of that, because every monument, historical monument that you go to will more or less will be managed by ASI and ultimately by Ministry of Culture, right? So and this has been a problem for many persons with disabilities, that many monuments that they go to are not accessible. In
Right.
terms of accessibility, they provide bare minimum, and I'm talking about monuments as famous as Taj Mahal or maybe the Humayun tomb in Delhi, New Delhi, right? So these are the monuments, or maybe the Qutub Minar. So the ASI has been doing bare minimum in terms of accessibility by providing ramp or providing braille at the counter service, right? So now these guidelines are very have comprehensively laid down the parameters on which accessibility shall be ensured, right? So for Ministry of Culture has almost 26-page document wherein they have provide how accessibility should be ensured when person comes on the ticket counter. What should be the accessibility mandate when person walks to the monuments, right? For instance, there shall be braille service, there shall be ramp of a particular width and there shall be a holding rail at a particular height, right? So these are very technical elements and specific elements that are architecturally, have been maybe consulted, which provide at accessibility at every level, including toilets, parking spaces, right? So there are very technical guidelines that are out there. And similarly, I come to Ministry of Sports and then maybe go into what's the problem with these guidelines currently
Right.
as they stand, right? So similarly, Ministry of Sports also, these guidelines will cover everything that comes under Ministry of Sports. The guideline by Ministry of Sports are interesting because they are not just restricted to you and I in terms of person with disability, as in they are not just for general public, but they're also for sportsmen with disabilities. And given the importance of para Olympics that we have seen, the success of para athletes in the Olympics, these guidelines sort of become a more important to scrutinize, and maybe I think public should see pay close scrutiny to these provisions, because these guidelines would directly affect those sports persons as well. So what in these guidelines is that sports ministry has prescribed similarly to Ministry of Culture, as in they have provided mandatory guidelines for parking spots, mandatory guidelines for stadiums, mandatory guidelines for sports complex, as in what should be the seating arrangement for wheelchair persons, what should be the width of the stands, what should be the symbols, direction symbols, how should the braille templates should be installed at a different places. So these are again very technical and architecturally associated guidelines that have been incorporated within sports ministry, and they've also sort of tried to cover each and every element, as in they have not just tried to focus on the infrastructure element, but also in terms of information and communication element, ICT, in terms of information dispersal, as in what will be the means of communication when they are live streaming the sports, etc., etc. So these are
Right.
again very technical, elements or the specific clauses in these guidelines. Again, I must reiterate that because these guidelines also affect the disabled sports persons or the persons who are disabled and wish to engage in sports activity, I think the scrutiny of these clauses becomes imperative. Yeah, so this is the broad framework of how these two guidelines are operating.
Okay. Excellent. Thanks for sharing, Shashank. For those of us who have just joined in, I'll just do a quick recap. We're speaking about a number of different guidelines and policy mandates that have come out from different ministries in the recent past all relating to accessibility. Today, we're with Shashank and we're speaking specifically about accessibility guidelines that have come out for sports venues, sports stadiums, as well as for cultural venues and sites. Okay, great. So, Shashank has just given us a little bit of a brief about why all of a sudden there are numerous guidelines that are coming out. What are these specific guidelines all about? Shashank, I think the burning question really is from in your perspective and opinion, what are a couple of things that these guidelines are missing, not adequately addressing, and what is perhaps your wish list that you wish would have been covered in these guidelines?
Right. So again, I'll start with the Ministry of Culture because that 26-page document should technically have been just 5-page document in my opinion. Because so the Ministry of Culture has provided detailed infrastructure guidelines. So they have gone on for 19 pages as to mandate what should be the height, accessibility need in general toilets, what should be the accessibility needs for special toilets, what should be the accessible infrastructure elements in parking slots, etc., etc., and the likes which the Ministry of Culture covers. And then on the, I think around page 2021, they mention that and the guidelines formulated under the guidelines built by Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs will obviously apply, right? Now, just to give you context, the guideline released by Ministry of Housing, Housing and Urban Affairs, were released last year in 2022, and they are a very comprehensive guideline.
Right.
It's an almost 80-page document that covers every element of infrastructure that could be there because it's prepared with the expertise of IIT Roorkee. So it's a very comprehensive document that itself covers almost everything that could be made accessible infrastructure-wise.
Right.
So you see, right. Also, because another thing that why that guideline is important is because that guideline has changed the discourse from having environment barrier-free to having a universal design. Now, when I say universal design, that changes the entire contours, the discourse around the accessibility, as in, then universal design is not just for the person with disabilities. Universal design is for everyone, including elderly, including women. So one of the instances that guideline has cited is, for instance, if a woman is wearing sari, right? So there are certain elements that restrict your movement because of your attire, right? So that universal guidelines take cognizance of that fact as well. For children who maybe have a different need because of their age, or person who are temporarily disabled. So if you are injured, etc., that guideline also takes cognizance of that, and hence it has like real guideline for that. So I think the infrastructure guideline that Ministry of Culture has prescribed were already there in built-in guidelines that were released last year by Housing and Urban Affairs Ministry. They simply could have cross-reference because the guidelines the Ministry of Culture has are very, very general in nature, right? They have a one-line mandate, and you can't decipher what they mean by it. For instance, they have a mandate of that accessible needs shall be ensured at the ticket counter, right? Now, what do you mean by accessible needs at the ticket counter? Now, if you see the last year guideline of Housing and Urban Affairs, they have specifically mandated what should be the height of the ticket counter, whether there should be a specific ticket counter for PWDs, right? So there are specific clauses that are mentioned, right? So that is the first problem, that there is no unity that Ministry of Culture has come up with. There is already a detailed guideline that is existing. So if you come up with your own guideline, you are just creating confusion for people or the businesses who are going to construct these facilities, right? So if you are talking about ease of business, you can't have multitude of guidelines that are going to create confusion for those businesses, because they are now confused whether they have to follow Ministry of Culture guideline or Ministry of Housing and Affairs, because both sort of deal with a similar situation, right? So that is the first element that is problematic with Ministry of Culture's guideline. Second element that's problematic is that they have gone beyond their mandate, as in they have also gone in length about information communication technology accessibility, right? Now, Ministry of Culture has certain things, for instance, museums under its domain, wherein there are facilities which require accessibility to an extent which are distinct to Ministry of Culture, right? Because of the nature of museum. So they should have gone into the specifics of that, right? And should have left the other mandate of ensuring ICT accessibility to Ministry of IE, Ministry of Information and Technology, which is a more,
Right.
uh, professional or sort of a more proper nodal agency to do that. Right? They haven't gone into that. They have just gone into the brief overview of how accessibility shall be ensured on their website, right? And they have just given a general explanation. Okay,
Right.
this should be there, this should be there, this should be there, right? They haven't mentioned how and how they should be incorporated within their expertise, especially the museum, right? Museum activities and other activities that are within their domain. And the second fault within it is that they have referred to WCAG guidelines, which is Universal ICT guidelines,
Correct.
which is developed by World Wide Web Consortium. So
Right.
that's accepted worldwide guideline for ensuring digital accessibility. But
Right.
the accessibility mandate that they have referred is 2.0. And now the World Wide Web has come up with 2.2. So 2.0
Right.
is 5 years back. So they have came with 4.2 5 or 6 years back. So that already outdated mandate, right? So they shouldn't have relied on. So these are the problems with Ministry of Culture. Right, sorry, I went on wrong with it. So coming out of the Ministry of Sports, so Ministry of Sports has a very like detailed mandate with respect to the infrastructure again, and sort of more or less they sort of are compatible with 2022 guidelines. But again, that point stays that they should have cross-referenced the 2022 guidelines because they are very detailed.
Right.
And when you're talking about counter service and these parking spaces, these are general across domains, be it museum, be it transport, be it railway station, be it airport. These are universal and that guideline already covers. Wherein you think that domain is not covered, you should have only dealt with that because that's only going to create multitude of complexities
Correct.
even for those people who are building those infrastructure and also people who are claiming, for instance, person with disabilities, right? They don't know what claim they should make. The second element that's very problematic with sports ministry is that they have fixated on the visible form of disabilities. Now, this is very big problem with policy making that they have only relied upon visible form of disabilities. So we'll see at a lot of places that they have used the word like physical assistance, wheelchair should
Right.
should be wheelchair accessible, should be wheelchair accessible, should be visually accessible, right? There are almost half of disabilities out of 21 that are recognized that are invisible in nature, right? So the support system for these kind of disabilities is totally absent
Right.
within the sport ministry guideline, right? And the other thing that's out there is again when they're talking about this sporting facilities, so they have given mandate for just three disabilities. For instance, person with visual impairment, person with
Right.
hard of hearing,
Right.
and person with any sensory difficulty, right? So they have given specific mandate of how accessibility shall be ensured for these three categories. But there is total absence of how accessibility shall be ensured at sporting complexes for other disabilities.
Right.
And I'm talking in terms of enjoying the sporting event, right? Specifically that because they have mentioned within that. So these are the two broad problem with sports ministry's guideline that is out there. And invisibility of invisible disabilities is a theme that runs throughout their document.
Right, right. Okay. So thanks for that. I think streamlining guidelines again, point very well taken because the National Institute of Urban Affairs, for example, has done a lot of work on actually working with IIT Kanpur, working with officers at the urban local body level to develop these guidelines. To then have ministries come in and say that they're going to follow something entirely different or contradictory is really causing more confusion than good. So, Shashank, I think we have just a few minutes left, and we have two questions from the audience, one from Srijan Rai and another one from Shubh 14 AM, who I'm guessing is Shubham. The questions are more linked to implementation. Are there any mandates within these regulations for implementation? My question to actually add to this is that um, how do you bridge these implementation gaps in the quickest turnaround time? Now, we all, from living in our sort of spaces, know that there are really large gaps in being able to, in actually being able to implement some of these guidelines. But to add to the questions that have been asked, my question really is how do you bridge that gap in a sort of leapfrogging way rather than, waiting like maybe 10, 15, 20 years to be able to actually support the ecosystem with proper implementation. I'll leave you with that
Right.
question and then we can take
Right.
things from there.
Just Just give me a minute to check the background of which these guidelines have been brought in, apart from the legal mandate. All these guidelines have been brought in to implement Accessible India campaign, right? Which is a 2015 campaign. So that campaign precedes the act itself, right?
Right.
So there is a problem with that act, that program itself. And if you have a question, I'll answer that. But coming into the implementation part, so again, I'll take recourse to the legal mandate. So, for instance, Rule 16 of the RPWT rules, right? So these amendments are being brought under Rule 15, and the following rule, which is Rule 16, have is makes has a clause which says that the central government shall review the implementation of the accessibility mandate, right? It talks about implementation, the central government shall review, but it doesn't talk about what should be the implication if they don't comply with the accessibility mandate. So there is an absence of enforcement mechanism. Ki what if the Ministry of what if the Ministry of Transport is not complying with the mandate of the guidelines that it has incorporated, or maybe a department under it that's not complying with the necessary mandate, or maybe the state government is not complying with it, right? What would be the recourse that central government has at its disposal to ask for the implementation of the guideline? There is no clarity with respect to that, right? That is the first hurdle that comes with implementation. That is, there no enforcement mechanism. The only enforcement mechanism is there at an individual level. So if you and I are having a trouble or facing difficulty or accessibility issue, we have to approach the commissioner office individually, right, with a complaint that this is the discriminatory practice or the accessibility need that I'm facing, and then that complaint is going to be sorted out, right?
Right.
The only recourse that central government has is sort of a directory and not an enforcement mechanism. That is the first problem that's there, that Rule 16 is not being. First, there is no enforcement mechanism. Second, the Rule 16 is not even being used.
Right.
Central government hardly takes any actions, even directly, when it comes to accessibility requirement. Asking department to ensure accessibility requirement. Also, one of their major defense is that there is no accessibility mandate. But now these guidelines have come in, so maybe we see the change of stance, right? Second, with respect to implementation, is so there is when it comes to, again, Accessible India campaign is sort of an umbrella scheme which which sort of designates whether a particular place is accessible or not, right? So if you ask the government through maybe RTI or any mode of communication which buildings are accessible, they will provide you information that these buildings have been made accessible under Accessible India campaign, right? And they have a proper checklist to ensure, which they have just mark, go on the building, check it, sort of physical audit that they do, right? And just when the majority of those are fulfilled, they say that yes, this building is compliant, right? But the problem is that that list is already outdated and doesn't comply with what the new guidelines or the new necessities are, right? That is the procedural hardship that is there. The other is Section 48 talks about social audit. Now, social audit means if you have made a infrastructure accessible, for instance, a foot over bridge, you have made accessible by providing lift and an escalator, right? But how many people are actually using it, or how efficient it is working? Whether after the audit has been done, the people are actually using or not. That's the social audit, and the social audit mechanism is completely missing in India at all levels, especially at disability level, right? So you
Right.
don't have to do anything else to leapfrog, 10 or 20 years ahead. Just you already have a mechanism. It's just about using those mechanisms at your disposal, right? And using them more strictly, because resources are already provided. It's just that these resources are not being used. So I think if they try or maybe attempt after the implementation of these guidelines to use these social audit or maybe say Rule 16, etc., I think that would sort of have a major implication in terms of accessibility.
Understood. Understood. Okay. So there's a lot to be done in India's accessible policies and to make our public spaces more accessible. But as Shashank has shared with us, it's not all as grim as we may imagine. There are a lot of possibilities for us to use the regulations that we have, and also to advocate for certain changes that we want, certain standardization that we see is important through the consultation process as well. So, Shashank, I think that's all that we have time for today. But I wanted to extend a very heartfelt thanks to you for joining this conversation. I've learned a lot personally, and I'm sure everyone who's joined in has also learned a lot from this process. As Shashank mentioned, there are a number of regulations and guidelines coming from different ministries relating to accessibility of public spaces like airports, sports facilities, culture facilities, those are currently open.
Railway.
Railways,
Railway.
exactly. So I think one of the things that I just wanted to highlight is that at this very moment, we have the opportunity to participate and also to create a lot more awareness and build actually the policies out for the future as well. So inviting everyone who's joined us today to please share your feedback on the consultation, this one and the ones to come. And huge thanks, Shashank, for joining us today. We hope to make this sort of policy decoded series of Instagram lives more frequent as we go along. And to that effect, if any of you do have any ideas, for what we can call this series, and Shashank, please pitch in as well, what we should chat about next, do feel free to DM us, and we'll be more than happy to engage in that. We do have a couple of comments on accessibility of railways as well. And I think those are all important conversations. So do keep the comments and conversation going, and we'll look forward to sharing some of these inputs with the government as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Andra, for having me. Hopefully, I was able to add a few inputs into the discourse.
Thanks, Shashank. It's been great to have you, and really lovely conversation. Looking forward to speaking soon.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks everyone for joining. Bye-bye.